I have carried this for 20 years. Longer than that, if I count the promise, which I made when I was 9 years old without knowing what I was agreeing to. What I know now, sitting here at 71 with Rook at my feet and the tree line visible from this window, is that my father was carried out of a killing whiteout by something the land around Smithers had been sheltering since before my great-great-great-grandfather drove his first fence post into the Bulkley Valley clay. Carried. A quarter mile to the fence line in -14 Celsius, in a storm that should have been his grave. And I know this not because I was there, but because my mother wrote it down, and because 42 years after my father's rescue, I stood at the same fence line, in the same late October cold, and understood at last what I had promised to protect. I need to go back to understand why I was standing there. My name is Shane Mercer. I am 71 years old. I spent 33 years as a timber cruiser for the BC Forest Service, working primarily in the Bulkley Valley corridor and the drainages feeding west off the Telkwa Range. 33 years of walking crown blocks with a diameter tape and a clinometer and a tally sheet, measuring trees against a formula, recording what the land held. That is not a metaphor. That is the work exactly as it was. You learn to read country in that trade the way a doctor reads a patient, not with hope or fear, but with the expectation of accuracy, because the figures go on record and incorrect figures cost someone money, and sometimes cost someone their life. I say this not to impress anyone. I say it because a man who has spent 33 years learning to see exactly what is in front of him, to resist the temptation to record what he hoped was there instead of what was, is not the man you would expect to tell the account I am about to tell. And I have thought about that a long time. I have thought about it every time I almost told someone and stopped myself. The credential is the only thing I have to offer in place of proof, and so I offer it plainly. My father, Walter Mercer, ran cattle on a property outside Smithers for most of his adult life. The ranch had been in the family since 1899, when my great-great-great-grandfather Lyle Mercer homesteaded the parcel and built the first structure on it, a 2-room frame building that was gone before my father was born. The land itself was 160 acres in total, but the parcel that mattered, the one that had been in every generation's accounting and in every generation's unspoken awareness, was the North 40. 40 acres of mixed pasture and second-growth timber pressed against Crown land to the north, with a fence line along the top edge that my father maintained by hand every spring. The Bulkley Valley holds weather the way a basin holds water. It fills up with cloud from the west, and the cold comes down from the plateau to the northeast. And when those two things meet in late October, you do not always get warning. My father understood this. He had worked that land since he was a boy, had been born 2 miles from where he died, and knew the upper pasture the way a man knows his own hands. He went out on October 22nd, 1961, to check on a section of fence he had noted was sagging. He was 32 years old. The sky that morning was grey and still, which in the valley in October means nothing in particular. He did not come back at noon. My mother, Edna, noted it without alarm because my father was not a man who kept tight to schedules when the work required otherwise. She noted it again at 2 in the afternoon, when the window behind the kitchen table had gone white with what had moved in from the west. A hard, driven, blinding snowfall that cut visibility to less than the length of a truck. She told me, years later, that she had sat at that table and started calculating. The upper pasture was a quarter mile from the house. He had good boots, a canvas jacket, and the fence line to follow back if the snow caught him. She made herself stay at the table and count on those things. He came through the door at 3:40 in the afternoon, She said he sat down in the chair nearest the door and did not say anything for several minutes. He was not injured. He was not frostbitten. He had lost one glove somewhere on the upper pasture, and his left hand was cold, but intact. He drank the coffee she put in front of him, and then he told her what had happened. He told it to her once, plainly, and then he never said it aloud again, not to anyone, including me. He had been at the fence line when the storm came in. He had started back toward the house, following the fence as planned, and the snow had thickened faster than he had judged it would. And somewhere along the north wire he had lost his bearing. The upper pasture has a low roll to it, a ridge no more than 8 feet high running east to west, and in blinding snow with no visibility. A man who crosses that ridge going the wrong direction will walk north into the timber instead of south toward the buildings. My father had crossed it wrong. He knew it when the ground changed under his boots. He turned back, but in the white he could not find the ridge again, and he told my mother he had understood, in the way a man understands practical things, that he was in serious difficulty. What happened next is my mother's account of my father's account, written in the household ledger she kept on the second shelf of the kitchen cupboard. She recorded it that same evening, November 22nd, 1961, in her careful, compact handwriting, with the temperature noted in the margin. -14 Celsius by the thermometer on the porch post at 5 o'clock. I have read that entry many times. What it describes is this: something came to my father in the white. Something very large, moving without sound in the blowing snow. He could not see it clearly. What he could tell was its size, which was considerable, and its movement, which was deliberate and unhurried, and the fact that it positioned itself against his left side and began to move him south. Not forcefully. He described it, through my mother's pen, as being guided rather than dragged, as if the thing beside him knew where the fence line was and was simply taking him to it. A quarter-mile in driving snow and -14, with one glove on the ground somewhere behind him. It set him down at the lower fence line, the one that runs along the south boundary of the upper pasture, within sight of the house lights. Then it was gone. He stood there in the snow and watched the house lights until he could feel his feet again, and then he walked in. My mother wrote all of this down. She wrote it without embellishment, in the same register she used to record weather and cattle tallies, and the dates she put up preserves. At the bottom of the entry she wrote one additional sentence, which I will give you here because it is short and because it matters. W says it has been there a long time. His grandfather knew it. Lyle knew it first. I did not read that ledger until 1987, when my father died and my mother handed it to me with a padlock key taped to the cover. I was 33 years old. I had been cruising timber for the Forest Service for 6 years by then. I sat at the same kitchen table where my father had drunk his coffee after coming in from the storm, and I read the entry 3 times. Then I sat there for a while. Here is what I need to tell you before I go further. In 1963, when I was 9 years old, my father called me into that kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, which was not something he did, and asked me to sit down across from him. He was not a ceremonial man. He did not make speeches. He told me that the North 40 was family land and had been for a long time, and that there were obligations that came with it, and that one of those obligations was that I was never to bring strangers onto that parcel uninvited, and never to encourage anyone to go looking up in the timber at the back of the upper pasture. I asked him why, because I was 9 and that was the natural question. He said, "Because we owe something there. You'll understand it when the time comes." Then he went back out to the yard, I thought about that instruction off and on for 24 years. I kept it. The way you keep a promise when you understand it matters even if you cannot say exactly why. I did not take anyone up to the North 40's back timber. I discouraged questions about it when the odd neighbour asked, which happened occasionally, because that stretch of fence was visible from the county road, and the timber behind it was old second growth, standing thick and dark in a way that drew the eye. Reading the ledger in 1987, 2 weeks after my father's funeral, I understood for the first time what I had agreed to protect. I did not know what to do with that understanding. I was a working timber cruiser. I had a good truck, a rented apartment in Smithers, and the ranch to figure out what to do with. My mother was still living in the house at that point, still getting around without much trouble. I did not raise the subject of the ledger with her that fall. I was not ready. I raised it the following spring, over coffee at the same table. I had the ledger open to the page. She sat down across from me and looked at it, and said, "I wondered when you were going to ask." I asked her whether she had ever doubted what my father told her. She thought about it for a moment, turning her coffee cup in both hands, the way she did when she was considering something carefully. "No," she said. "He wasn't a man who said things he hadn't seen." I asked her about Lyle, about how far back the family account actually went. She said that my father's grandfather, who would have been Lyle's son or grandson, I cannot now reconstruct the exact generation, had told Walter that the first encounter was in 1899, in the homesteading year, and that Lyle had found the creature watching the north parcel from the timber and had decided, for reasons he never elaborated on, to let it alone and to ask his family to do the same. Whether Lyle had an encounter of his own, a rescue or an act of care the way Walter had in 1961, my mother did not know. What had come down through the family was only the ordinance, as she called it. Leave it alone, and it will watch over what is yours. 6 generations. From 1899 to the present. I have done that count carefully. My mother died in 2001. She never doubted the North 40. She never asked me to take her up to the upper pasture fence line, and I never offered. But in the last year of her life, she said to me once, on a winter afternoon when we were sitting in the kitchen and the light was going early outside, "Your father always believed we were looked after up there. I think he was right about it." She said it the way she said most things, not dramatically, just as a fact she had finished weighing. I am getting to my own account. I want you to understand the ground under it first. In 1994, I was working a crown timber block adjacent to the North 40's upper boundary. It was a costing cruise for the district, which meant I was walking transects and recording merchantable volume, nothing unusual. I had worked dozens of blocks in that drainage over the years. I knew the country, or I thought I did, the way a man in that trade comes to think he knows a place after enough time in it. On a Thursday in late September, the third transect of the morning took me along the edge of the block close to the private property boundary, which in this case was the back fence line of the North 40's upper pasture. I had walked that transect alignment twice before on earlier trips into the block. What stopped me the third time was a track sequence in the soft ground, where a small creek crossed the mineral soil, maybe 30 feet north of the fence line. I want to be precise about this because precision is what I have in place of anything else. The tracks were bipedal. The stride length was 58 inches, which I measured with my tape because I measure things. That is what the tape is for. The foot impression in the softest section of the creek bank was 17.5 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball. I have seen bear tracks in soft ground deform and spread. I have seen them overlay each other and read as large and unfamiliar. I crouched over those tracks for several minutes, and I made myself go through every explanation available to me. I tried bear. The toe configuration was wrong. I tried a man in very large boots. The depth and the pressure pattern were wrong. Too heavy for a man, and no boot leaves that particular curve at the heel. I tried a logging artifact, some piece of equipment I was not familiar with. There was no equipment access to that ground. The nearest skid road was 300 meters west. I stood up and noted the measurements in my tally book, because that is what you do with what you find. Then I walked another 50 meters along the transect and stopped again. Someone had stacked wood. Not randomly fallen timber, not a blowdown, not a debris line left by snowmelt. 11 pieces of limb wood, each between 2 and 3 inches in diameter, arranged in a parallel stack against the base of a spruce, each piece roughly the same length, not cut but snapped cleanly at consistent intervals. The stack was maybe 3 feet high. It sat in a small clearing where no logging had occurred, where there was no reason for a person to be working. I looked at it for a long time. I tried to construct a reason for it to be there. I could not. I noted the location in my tally book and walked on. I did not tell anyone about the tracks or the stack. I thought about them on the drive back to Smithers that evening and for a number of days after. I was 40 years old, a working professional who depended on his ability to see things accurately, and what I had seen did not fit any category I had. I kept coming back to the measurements. 58-inch stride, 17.5 inches. I knew those numbers were not a bear. A man of that stride length and foot size would stand near 7 feet and weigh over 400 pounds by any reasonable estimate. And no such man had any business being in that drainage alone on a workday, stacking limb wood against a spruce for no purpose I could identify. I thought of the ledger. I thought of my father at the lower fence line watching the house lights. I thought of Lyle driving his first post into the clay in 1899. I set it aside. That is the honest account of what I did. I set it aside because I was not ready, and because there was nothing to be done with it, and because the promise I had made to my father at 9 years old seemed to me to include not pressing too hard against what the North 40 had arranged for itself over 6 generations. Rook came to me in 1998, a cattle dog, black and tan, from a litter born on a neighbouring property down the valley. He was a working dog by disposition, attentive, unhurried, capable of holding still for long periods when the situation required it. I had begun running a small herd on the ranch by then, enough cattle to justify the pastures, and Rook took to the work without much instruction. He was a sensible animal. He did not spook at ordinary things. What I noticed, starting in the first fall I had him and continuing every subsequent year, was that Rook was not ordinary at the tree line of the upper pasture. Everywhere else on the property he behaved the way a good cattle dog behaves, alert to the animals, responsive to instruction, calm about weather and machinery and the general noise of ranch work. At the tree line, he was different. Not frightened. That is the word I want to be careful about. He was not frightened. He would stand at the fence line facing the dark timber, ears forward, tail low and still, and simply watch. He would hold that position for minutes at a time. Then he would come away from the fence at my call and go back to whatever we were doing. There was no growling, no hackles, no distress. It was the body language of a dog watching something it had decided was not a threat, but was worth observing carefully. I noticed it the way I notice most things, which is to say I filed it and let it wait for context. The context arrived in October 2003. I had taken a week off from a late-season cruise to close up the ranch for winter, the kind of work that accumulates over a season and needs a concentrated stretch, checking fence, pulling the irrigation lines, getting the herd sorted before the first hard freeze. Rook was with me every day. The weather that week had been cold and dry, unusual for the valley in October, and I had been moving fast to get the work done before the forecast changed. On the afternoon of October 22nd, 2003, which I will tell you, is the same date as my father's account in 1961. I did not intend any significance in going out to the upper pasture that afternoon. I had a fence repair noted from the previous week, a section of wire that had sprung loose from a post near the north corner. Routine work. Rook came with me. The sky to the west had been building all day, the particular grey-white thickness that the valley produces when the weather is going to change fast and hard. I was working the wire back onto the staple when the snow came. It came in the way October snow in that valley sometimes does, not gradually, but as a curtain. One moment the air was grey and cold and still, and then the snow was horizontal, and the visibility was gone. I had experienced this before. I finished threading the wire, dropped my fencing pliers into my coat pocket, and turned to follow the fence line back down toward the house. Rook was not beside me. I called him. His name carried short in the wind and snow. I called 3 times, then stopped and listened. Nothing. I looked along the fence line in the direction of the timber and could not see past 10 feet. I took a step toward the house, calculated what I knew. I had the fence line. I had my boot tops to read the slope. I was 200 yards from the buildings, and I had been on this land since childhood. I was not in the difficulty my father had been in. I told myself this carefully. I started down the fence. I heard Rook then, not a bark, a short, deliberate vocalization he used to indicate he had found something and was staying with it. I had heard it before when he located a calf in brush. I stopped. I turned back toward the tree line. Here is where I need to go slowly, because what happened next deserves accuracy more than it deserves speed. I walked to the fence line at the north edge. Rook was there, sitting in the snow 2 feet from the bottom wire, facing into the timber, his tail moving slowly. In the timber, at a distance I judged later as 30 feet, there was something standing. The snow reduced it to a shape, tall, dark-haired, still in the way that only a thing with intention is still. Not frozen in alarm. Deliberately at rest, weight settled, facing me across the fence. The scale of it registered in my body before my mind caught up with what I was seeing. I am 6'1". I know what a man looks like in timber. Whatever was standing in those trees was considerably more than that, broad through the chest and shoulders in a proportion I have no trade equivalent for. I stood at the fence. Rook did not move. The snow came between us and the shape, and for a moment the shape was gone, and then it was there again, and I understood that it had not moved at all. I do not know how long I stood there. I have thought about this, and I believe it was 3 or 4 minutes, though it carried the quality of longer time, of something that was not governed by the same clock as the rest of my life. The shape in the timber was watching me in a way that felt neither threatening nor indifferent. I want to be careful about what I claim to know here. I cannot tell you what it was thinking. I cannot tell you what it intended. What I can tell you is how I read it, as one living thing reads another across a distance, tentatively and with humility. It seemed to me that it had been there for some time before I arrived, and that it knew the fence line, and that it had come to the edge of its timber the way something comes to the edge of its territory when it has a reason to be seen. Then it did something I have turned over in my mind every day since. It moved. 2 or 3 steps unhurried to its left, and in the snow and the broken light through the firs, I saw what it had been standing in front of. On the ground, partially sheltered by the largest fir, there was an arrangement of spruce boughs, laid flat and overlapping the way a man lays shingles, a dry platform maybe 4 feet across, positioned against the base of the tree out of the direct wind. Beside the bough platform, 3 pieces of limb wood had been placed upright, the same diameter and the same clean-snapped preparation I had seen in 1994. A small stack, 3 pieces, placed deliberately within arm's reach of the dry platform. It had built shelter. At the fence line, in the exact location where my father had been set down in 1961, it had prepared something, laid it out against the tree as if it had known the storm was coming and had known someone would be at the fence. I put my hand on the top wire of the fence, not to cross it, just to touch it. Rook pressed his shoulder against my right leg. The shape in the timber was still. I said in a voice that came out quieter than I intended, "All right." I do not know why those were the words. They were the honest ones. The shape stood there for another interval I cannot accurately measure. Then it turned, not abruptly, not in alarm, but with the same deliberateness it had shown throughout, and moved north into the timber. In 3 steps, it was gone. The timber closed behind it, and there was only the snow and the dark of the firs, and Rook breathing steadily beside my knee. I stood at the fence line for a long time after. The snow was easing. The house lights came on below me in the blue-grey dark, the timer switch on the porch that I had set the week before. I watched them come on, and I thought about my father, 32 years old, standing at this same wire, watching the same lights. I thought about the -14 in my mother's ledger. I thought about what it would mean to stand in that cold and in that storm without this fence to hold on to, and then to be set down here with the lights in front of you. I reached over the fence and laid my hand on the spruce boughs. They were dry. They were placed with care. I made my way down to the house. Rook stayed close. I went inside, took off my coat and boots, and stood in the kitchen for a while before I sat down. On the second shelf of the kitchen cupboard where my mother had kept it and I had kept it after her, the household ledger was in its place, padlock open, the key on the same small hook she had put it on 30 years ago. I took it down and set it on the table and opened it to the page I had memorized. W says it has been there a long time. His grandfather knew it. Lyle knew it first. I sat with that for a long while. Rook put his chin on my boot. I thought about my father calling me into this kitchen when I was 9, the Sunday afternoon light through the same window, his voice that did not rise or perform. Because we owe something there. He had known, even then, that the words would not mean much to a 9-year-old, and had asked me to carry the obligation anyway, trusting that the time would come when I would understand it. He had been right about that. It had just taken me 40 years, and an October storm, and a pair of dry spruce boughs at a fence line to finish the understanding. And I thought about my mother, about what she had said on that winter afternoon in the last year of her life, that my father had always believed we were looked after up there. She had refused her whole life to treat the North 40 as ordinary land. She had kept the ledger. She had locked it and given me the key. She had sat across from me at this table in 1988 and said, "He wasn't a man who said things he hadn't seen." With the composure of a woman who had weighed the evidence for 40 years and come to a conclusion she was not going to revise for anyone. She had been right, and she had known she was right, and she had died knowing it, and I had not said so to her directly in the years when I could have. That is a cost I have carried alongside the other ones. The weeks after the encounter were quiet. I finished closing the ranch for winter. I drove back to Smithers, back to the last season of my cruising work, and did not tell anyone what had happened at the fence line. I thought about who I might tell. I thought about it the way you think about practical problems, listing what you know about the recipient, what they would do with the information, whether they had the ground under them to hold it. I could not find a name. My father was gone. My mother was gone. The people I worked with were good men and women who would have listened politely and reserved their judgment in the way that professional courtesy requires. And that was not what I needed from a listener. What I needed was a listener who would not require me to defend it, who would take the credentialing block on its own terms and let the account stand on what it was. I am still looking for words adequate to what I saw at that fence line. I am not sure they exist in the register I know how to use. What I have instead are the measurements, a 58-inch stride recorded in a tally book in 1994, a shelter of spruce boughs laid against a fir in a storm in 2003, a household ledger entry from November 1961, noting a temperature of -14 and a man who came home when he should not have. I kept the promise. I kept it until now. The reason I am telling this today is not dramatic, and I will not dress it up as one. I am 71 years old. My joints are doing what joints do at 71. The ranch is in good order, the herd small but sound, the fences maintained. Rook is getting grey around his muzzle, which is not a thing I enjoy observing, but he is still at the tree line in the evenings, still holding that attentive, unhurried watch. The North 40 is still the North 40. The timber at the back of the upper pasture is still standing, which in this valley, in this era, is not something you take for granted. What changed is that I decided the account was going to outlive me. My father kept it until he died. My mother kept it until she died. The ledger is in a fireproof box now, the kind you can order from a hardware catalogue, sitting on the shelf above this desk, and that is a responsible act of record-keeping. But a fireproof box is not a listener, and I am 71 years old, and the weight of this thing is not something I intend to take with me unspoken. There are things I do not know and will not pretend to. I do not know whether what watched over this land for 6 generations was one creature or a pattern of creatures. I do not know what Lyle Mercer saw in 1899 that led him to the ordinance, the leave it alone, and it will watch over what is yours that came down through the family without full explanation. I do not know whether the shelter at the fence line was prepared for me specifically, or whether it is prepared every October at that location as a matter of long habit for whoever from this family might need it. I have no way to know that, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. What I know is this. My father was set down at a fence line alive in a storm that should have killed him by something that knew where the fence was and where the lights were. I know that the same location was prepared in late October 2003, and that I was at that location, and that I read it as care. I know that 6 generations of my family were told to leave the North 40's back timber alone, and that 6 generations of my family did, and that the land returned that courtesy with something that does not fit any category I have been given for the world. I am the last one who holds the full account. What my father told my mother, what she wrote down, what I found in the tally book, and what I stood at the fence line and understood with my hand on the top wire. I have held it for 20 years since 2003, and before that, I held half of it, the promise without the reason, for 36 years before that. 60 years in total if you count from the kitchen table when I was 9. That is a long time to carry something alone. Lyle drove the first post in 1899. Walter stood at the lower fence in 1961 with one glove gone and the lights in front of him. My mother recorded -14 in the margin and never wavered from what she believed it meant. 6 generations watched over, and 6 generations watching in return, a compact made without language and kept without any enforcement except the willingness of each generation to honor what the one before it left them. I do not know what word to put on what I saw in the timber that afternoon. I have been looking for one for 20 years. I have decided it is probably not in the vocabulary I learned on the job, or in the vocabulary I grew up with either. There is no word in the trades for something that stands at the edge of its timber in a storm and builds a dry place for you at the fence line. What I can tell you is what the land does when you keep faith with it over enough time. What I can tell you is that the North 40 is 40 acres of pasture and second growth and old timber, and that something in that timber has watched over it and over the people whose obligation it became since before any of those people can remember, and that this seems to me, after 33 years of measuring wild country and 40 years of sitting with this account, like the truest thing I know about the Bulkley Valley. If you have ever stood at a tree line in the late light and felt the weight of something watching from the timber, something that was not threat and was not indifference, but was something older than either, hold on to that feeling. Do not explain it away if you can help it. The country up here is older than the categories we have built for it, and it keeps its own accounting. And on that accounting, my family has always come out ahead of what we deserved. Rook is at my feet right now. He has his chin on the floor and his eyes are pointed toward the window, and the line of dark timber visible above the upper pasture fence. He has been watching it all evening, still and calm and attentive, the way a good dog watches something it has decided is not a danger but is worth keeping track of. I understand exactly what he is doing.